Lacan, for his part, while concerned with the possibility of transforming the subject's organization, psychoanalysis is premised on this possibility, seeks to limn the structures in play. Put it at simplest, Deleuze is interested in what is upstream of the subject, while Lacan is committed to the impossible task of understanding the organization's downstream of pre-individual forces. Given the impossibility of the task, he necessarily failed, but the failure was instructive. Here as elsewhere, to quote from Seminar 17, quote, "Everything revolves around a lack of success." You'll recall that Freud, of course, said that analysis was interminable. So to be clear, the argument of this paper is not that Lacan had a fully elaborated theory of the subject, for he did not. On the question of the subject, he was in perpetual difficulties, by turns experimenting with the opposed notions of the subject as constituting, the subject defined as what identifies, and the subject as constituted, the subject whose cause is not itself but the signifier. Rather, this paper poses the question of whether the concept is dispensable. It is the argument of this paper that if we affirm with Derrida, quote, "the ineffaceable necessity of psychoanalysis," patient B awaits, that we should return to Lacan. In what Derrida speaks of as the future to come of psychoanalysis, Lacan may well become an irrelevance. Certainly in the light of Derrida and Deleuze, he appears more than ever a historical figure, the student of Hegel and Cantor, the follower of Freud, the contemporary of Sartre, the translator of Heidegger, the friend of Merleau-Ponty and Lévi-Strauss, etc., etc. But at the same time, it's equally apparent that he is not to be dismissed on the basis of the ungenerous, unintelligent, and highly impartial criticisms of Derrida and Deleuze. If, as Derrida claims, we have not yet begun to read Plato, the work of Derrida and Deleuze suggests that this is even truer of Lacan. However, if we are to return to him, that involves reading him as creatively as he read Freud, and Deleuze read Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Nietzsche, and Bergson. It is the measure of Freud and Lacan that if they were alive today, they would not write as they did. The question is, how would they write? It's impossible to say. Presumably in Lacan's case, he would have continued, as the phrase has it, to seek his honey elsewhere, not least in philosophy bookshops, and above all, he would have listened to his patients. Of the two strategies, the second is clearly the more important. Freud and Lacan did not conclude that there is a compulsion to repeat, that there is no sexual relation, and that God is unconscious on the basis of their reading of philosophy. Arguably, psychoanalysis has more to learn from patient B than any philosophy text. But of course, the two strategies are not finally separable. The words and actions of B do not come neatly packaged in a ready-made interpretation. We can only hear what we have ears to hear, so it's always important to introduce other concepts. Now, it's far from self-evident that the concepts created by Deleuze offer the most useful route. Obviously, his rivals, Levinas and Badiou, can also, in their very different ways, lay claim to the attentions of psychoanalysis. For example, with Levinas, psychoanalysis could set aside the fashionable focus on the injunction, confined, incidentally, to a single seminar, namely 7, to not give way on one's desire, in favour of the ethics implicit in the analyst's obligation to her patients. In other words, it could abandon any commitment to immanence, and instead seek to make good the infinite debt to the other. Alternatively, it could take a wholly opposed direction and seek to fulfill the project of mathematical formalization and transmission integrity announced in Encore by developing Badiou's reading of Cantor's set theory. The next section I now have my doubts about, so I will very briefly just summarize what's in it. Effectively, what I try and do, and I would do it differently now, is to mobilize the concept of the virtual in relation to Lacan. Not the virtual in the sense that he uses it in the mirror phase, but rather the virtual as in Deleuze, where it is opposed to the actual, and the concept points to the fact that the unforeseeable can never be, by definition, can never be predicted, that time is novelty, etc., etc., etc. And basically what I then go on to argue is that I think that Lacan would accept that notion of the virtual, and that what that highlights is the degree to which none of Lacan's pronouncements has the status of a dogma, that all of Lacan's teaching is exactly as, and I think this is actually where Deleuze may well have learned it, that Lacan's teaching is an experimentation. You remember that Deleuze says that to think is to experiment. In that sense, of course there are these dogmatic pronouncements like there is no sexual relation, but what is their status? Are they anything more than experimental? As I say, those final pages need to be worked on a bit. Right.